DanDaDan is a story about two high schoolers, and soon their friends, who find themselves in the throes of both alien and yokai disputes after a bet to prove the existence of either. Though the first season stops at 12 episodes, an especially odd junction for where it meets the manga story-wise, this anime is still an incredibly important entry into the current mainstream of shonen canon. It not only features a young woman as its protagonist, but addresses the stories and plights of young women in a way many other shonens and some shoujos struggle to, approaches nudity in a less objectifying manner, and all in an addicting to read and or watch format. Momo Ayase stars as our main character straight out of the gate, dumping her crappy boyfriend who obviously only sees her as an object, although not without some physical altercation. From interpersonal high school drama, to alien abduction, to female-targeted violence, we see these same plights of young women not only through the eyes of our protagonist, but through the eyes of past women and the victims of heinous crimes that targeted them. Women quite literally haunt the narrative, giving this fascinating paranormal anime even more depth. There's also quite a bit of nudity, some as moments of comedy and others of peril, but this weaves in well with the stories of violence against women and their roles within the story. Overall, DanDaDan is an incredible anime manga with a lot to offer, and its layered themes about women and the paranormal make it the story it is, as well as a groundbreaking shonen that keeps women in mind. Momo Ayase may be one of the most important female protagonists we see in a shonen to date, as we watch her go through the motions of girlhood in both typical and unusual situations. When the typical problems of girlhood are not shown directly, the unusual and paranormal often stand in as a metaphor for any of the problems women face in everyday life. In the first episode, we see Momo in a confrontation with her crappy boyfriend, the first direct instance of female objectification we see her subjected to. In response to wanting him to put in effort to go on a date, he replies, "Oh, but I'd be okay if you finally put out instead," implying he was really only dating her for her body. She tries to pick a fight with him, but isn't strong enough to do any damage, and he walks away, wanting nothing to do with her. This is not the last time we will see Momo in a compromising situation where men objectify her, but it's an important scene that highlights many of her future struggles as a young woman. Like many young women her age, this is a common occurrence that cannot always be solved with physical strength, something that anime does not typically address, especially in shonen. This is no typical shonen, though. Yukinobu Tatsu states in one interview, "I thought that there has never been a boys' manga with a girl as the main character, and I thought that just by having a girl as the main character, the conflicts would change in many ways and patterns." He wouldn't be completely correct about there being no female protagonist in shonen, main female protagonist, but he would be right about how it would change the story, were it to be about her and her journey as a young woman. Tatsu even writes Momo as a gyaru, someone who is very into a specific feminine fashion subculture, which is fitting, as it builds on the fact she has built femininity into her identity, really cementing her as an ultimate girl main character. We see that in the conflicts he builds for Momo. Her gender is a big part of the story alongside the paranormal, instead of being buried beneath the genre. It works with the genre like a glove on a hand instead, meshing together to create the best outcome possible. This may be in no small part due to his editor, Shihei Lin, who forced him to read hundreds of romance manga, according to an interview screened with the theater debut of the series. Although this was in an attempt to make the romance of the story stronger and more believable, it isn't surprising that Tatsu would also gain an innate understanding of the problems women deal with in society on a daily basis, while reading literature meant for women. Not only did this help the romance between Momo and Okarun, but the series as a whole when it came to conflicts people like Momo would come to face. One might say that this is why it's so groundbreaking for a shonen. It shows fleshed out conflicts that women face in terms of misogyny and objectification, instead of the more basic surface level conflicts of a simple damsel in distress. The paranormal conflicts really build on this understanding of women's issues, and they do it very well. In the first episode, we get a scene where Momo is violently abducted by 3 aliens and locked onto a platform with only her undergarments on. Alien abduction as a metaphor for reproductive assault isn't uncommon, but it's made incredibly clear in this scene. It isn't played for fan service, there's no unnecessary jiggle physics. Momo is in peril in a very common way. A man, or an alien disguised as one, threatens to take away her reproductive rights via intercourse and then harvest her organs. The aliens themselves may not completely understand the situation as Momo does, because they are attempting to mimic human interaction in order to pacify their victim. This is unfortunate for them, as many human interactions are not completely consensual, and will terrify their victim more as it simulates human violence instead of pleasure. Considering the tool they show Momo, they probably won't be having intercourse at all. It's something they say to get their victim to comply, working alongside their psychokinesis, designed to simulate the brainwaves of that kind of pleasure. But clearly this is an organ harvesting tool only. All that to say, they use a simulation of intercourse in order to steal their target's organs with no intercourse involved. It still makes a fascinating paranormal metaphor for exactly what the aliens are mimicking: an assault on a young woman's body and her reproductive rights. The results of such a situation are typically devastating, but this is a tale of triumph. Under immense pressure to save herself, Momo expresses psychic powers, possibly stimulated by the alien's psychokinetic energy and her determination to use her chi, allowing her to save herself with mental fortitude instead of physical strength. This transformation even displays the same traits as many magical girl transformations, effectively making her a shonen magical girl. The character sheds her old clothes, her naked silhouette shows against the screen, and then she takes on a new form with new powers. The only other choice would be to fall into despair as the trauma of her assault halts her life, something that is not uncommon among assault victims. Since most assault victims usually cannot overpower their attacker, whether they are weak or drugged, like how the aliens have used their psychokinesis as a stimulant, psychic powers make perfect sense for Momo. Sometimes a victim's only defense is their mental fortitude, their mind, their only weapon. For Momo, this results in her psychic powers in a kind of female empowerment fantasy. She then uses her powers to help others in similar situations throughout the series, giving them hope that they can be themselves again, including Okarun, who has had his wiener stolen from him. Literally. When she isn't fighting aliens or ghosts, Momo does go back to her regular schoolgirl life. We see how she interacts with friends and other students, and how she sometimes might use her powers for other things, like getting the drop on Ira. We get a fairly accurate depiction of what it's like to be a teenager when we aren't watching the action, and that's also just as important as Momo's newfound empowerment in the face of adversity. After all, it is still in part a comedy as well as a thrilling paranormal shonen, and her return to normal life where she can laugh with her friends is the reward for her hard work. Since DanDaDan is a paranormal shonen, there are also women that haunt the narrative who aren't like Momo. Girls and women who couldn't save themselves, physically or mentally. It is a story that is haunted by women, both literally and figuratively. Many of the storylines take the path of exploring their tragedies. Just as we experience Momo's pain with being objectified and assaulted and pursued, we experience the stories of young women in their lives before and after their death, caused by people with bad intentions. This is in no short part due to Tatsu's interest in horror, a genre often involved with women because of the horrible ways they've been treated historically. Tatsu even shares this sentiment in an interview, stating, "Many of the elements of monster stories are inspired by tragic events from the past. Even when listening to various ghost stories, monsters were originally human, and they didn't become what they wanted to be, so they don't feel like villains. I think they are people who are struggling with their own conflicts." Characters like Turbo Granny and Acrobatic Silky are part of this group, and join other legends across the world like La Llorona as women who face tragic deaths and are now known for their ghostly appearances in the living world. These tragedies are also what make them believable, not just as characters, but as people. With his main character being a young woman, it most likely made sense for him to include spirits like Turbo Granny and Silky that Momo can relate to on some degree. The tragic stories of other women are often carried by the younger generation, because it's a known fact that these things could eventually happen to them too, or may have in a different time. When they defeat the tunnel spirit, it's discovered that it was made up of the spirits of young girls. Seiko Ayase, Momo's grandma, states that this is where girls around your age were violated, cut to pieces, and tossed away, a statement that rings with truth for someone like Momo, because the girls were just like her, and she watched as their spirits faded away after their defeat. It's a truly haunting moment in the narrative, and highlights the vulnerability of young women and the tragedies that befall them. In Volume 1 of the manga, an extra at the end of the book states, "There is a theory that Turbo Granny's origin story originated from the tale of a young man who entered a mountain area and was chased by an old person who had survived after being abandoned there, which itself is based on the myth that during times when food was scarce, old women were abandoned deep in the mountains to reduce the number of mouths to feed." This must be part of the reason that Granny always showed up in places where spirits of girls met irrational deaths, as stated by Seiko in episode 4. Thus, Granny also haunts the narrative as a tragic character, albeit in the twilight of her life. In some ways, she parallels Momo. As she helps protect others in life, Granny helps protect them in death. She continues not just to haunt the narrative, but to influence it in its entirety by stealing Okarun's family jewels and scattering them to the four ends of the earth, and helping afterwards trapped inside a lucky cat statue. Silky is another one of the more notable spirits we encounter as well, being the spirit of a young mother crushed by those who stole away her only daughter. She is another victim, her life taken by the men who kidnapped her child, and her own desperation to get her baby back. Her story is explored more in depth as it intertwines with Momo's schoolmate Ira, whom she has a problem with after seeing her being disrespectful to Okarun. It truly makes her story as sad as Granny and her girls, as she wishes Ira could be her daughter, after she reached for Silky as a little girl, a young toddler who had just lost her mother, just as Silky had lost her daughter. Both their stories combine in a touching and sad display, as Silky gives up her life force to bring back Ira, who she had accidentally killed in a desperate attempt to keep her. It's a unique storyline in its exploration of motherhood and the sacrifice that comes with it, as well as the complications that come with being someone's daughter. A smaller character in the plotline that also fits in with these spirits would be the anatomical model Hana, who we see tossed away in episode 11. She's an older model, so she's worthless to the school now. It's a really obvious reference to how many women and their bodies are seen as less appealing or useless after a certain age, and how they may struggle to find love, worth, or meaning if a relationship and a family is something they had their heart set on. It's a funny and lighthearted side plot with a happy ending because Taro, the anatomical male figure, has Momo shelter her, and it's interesting to see how her story differs from the other spirits. She also doesn't appear to have been alive at any point, perhaps brought to life due to animism, the belief that even inanimate objects can have a soul. Her story is important nonetheless, as it shows us another side of women's issues, albeit in a veiled metaphor. With the wide variety of different fully fleshed out female characters and the different shapes that their stories take, the narrative is completely intertwined with women's issues. This is incredibly rare in shonen, and makes DanDaDan a very remarkable entry into the genre. From Momo to Seiko to Ira to Granny, Silky, and even Hana, these ladies' inclusion doesn't just add to the story, but is paramount to it. They are taken seriously as characters and as people. They aren't boiled down or flat in their characterizations the way many women are in shonen. These women make the narrative filled out and interesting, and don't detract from the plot, but serve as its backbone. It isn't the first shonen to feature a female protagonist by any means, despite what Tatsu believed at first, but it can be said that he was one of the first to be able to produce some of the most realistic, fleshed out, and varied women in a female-led shonen ever. It wouldn't be unfair to say that without women in it, DanDaDan simply wouldn't exist. When so many shonen seek to exclude them, women are what make DanDaDan a great story. Many people outside the readership of this story have shown their dislike for the amount of nudity in DanDaDan, namely on the grounds of exploitative fan service. It's understandable to be skeptical of the genre since many shonens use their underage characters as bait for the target audience, but DanDaDan doesn't use nudity in the name of fan service. Much of the nudity in the story is circumstantial, necessary, or played for a joke, and not in a fan service context where the viewer is supposed to feel a little bit on edge or horny. In the first episode, we see Momo Ayase in her underwear in the context of an alien abduction. Though many have shown their displeasure at this scene, it is not one meant to be risque. Momo is terrified, and the angle doesn't look particularly sexy. Neither the manga artists nor the animators have made her chest bounce in an unrealistic and fan service-like manner. She's simply tied up in an uncomfortable scene. And just because a scene is uncomfortable does not make it wrong to show. In fact, that is why it is so important. It is uncomfortable, so uncomfortable that our main character inadvertently gains psychic powers. Like coal turned into a diamond, Momo gains powers from the immense pressure to release herself from a potentially more dangerous situation. Some shoujos also show women naked as a sign of gaining power, as a shift into a new form, like the silhouettes and Sailor Moon transformations. Not to mention, many of the nude moments are usually plot-specific and not reserved for one gender or another. During the Nessie fight in episode 9, all the characters' clothes are shucked except for their underwear. Some viewers might think this is random fanfare, but just as Momo says in this part of the story, clothing must be removed in water for a quicker escape. Wet clothing, and especially shoes, weigh people down in water. It isn't all serious though, as many of the scenes are just played for laughs. Even within the same episode, the nudity is shown to be more funny and embarrassing for the characters and the audience than sexy. American cartoons do this fairly often. All DanDaDan is missing is a pair of heart-covered boxers for poor Okarun. As DanDaDan is also a comedy, this makes sense to include it in the story as a joke, not as fan service, but as a marker of one of its main genres. DanDaDan has already shown itself to be a comedy that likes to take dick jokes to the point where the entire plot revolves around finding a young man's family jewels, so nudity jokes should not be seen as out of the ordinary for its style of comedy. On a personal note, I also think it's important to destigmatize the act of being nude. It's not always sexual, it's just the way that we're born. In Japan, there are funny tanuki statues with their junk hanging out, and in European cities, there are nude statues of women and children on every block and every fountain. And in Iceland, you can find the famous Icelandic Philological Museum. To many places in the world, nudity is a state of being that, while sometimes embarrassing, cannot be entirely shameful, as it is our most natural state of being. In a Tumblr post from 2021, this gets discussed in detail as we see the finished take on being nude. The entire thing can be summed up as having never seen their grandma's tits. A reference to the fact that with Sana culture, one would see their family naked, and it would not be odd to see naked folks in a non-sexual context. I think this is important to remember as we watch shows from different cultures and try not to bring back the very limiting Hays Code from 1934, because morality is often personal and not all profanities are seen the same way. It's also important to show things that some people detest, otherwise we limit the imagination of the writer and insult the audience by assuming they cannot come to the logical conclusion of whether the actions of the character are right or wrong for themselves. It's also why films now have a rating system in place instead, even if perhaps it's a bit outdated. That's why if you're still on the fence about DanDaDan because you're worried about the exploitation of young women's bodies, there's no better way to decide than to watch it yourself. I promise that when you experience the depth of Momo's story and all the women who surround her, living or not, you may change your mind about the show as a whole. You can only truly form a real opinion after having experienced the show for yourself. Momo is a strong female lead with amazing female and male supporting characters whose stories are deep, tragic, funny, and more. The nudity is often just part of the plot, but it blends in so well with its brand of comedy, it never really becomes sickeningly similar to fan service. It's a landmark in the shonen genre, and is promising to be one of the most unforgettable shonen animes in history. DanDaDan returns July of 2025, but you can also read it on Viz or wherever you buy manga. For my friends who have already read and watched it, never fear, we could be seeing a lot more female protagonists for the genre soon. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure was finally able to have its one and only female lead animated, and a new manga to the scene is causing some uproar with its protagonist, Nomamoto of Drama Queen. There's also some contention around whether or not Inuyasha and Frieren are shonens, but they both have action and women are fantastic washes. Witch and the Beast might be considered, but the main girl is actually a genderless monster in the form of a young woman. Undead Unlock was only recently brought to my attention, but it also counts for one of the few shonen with a female protagonist, albeit she is fairly objectified. So even though Tatsu said, I thought there has never been a boys manga with a girl as a main character, and was slightly off the mark, I still personally like his Ana manga the best.